where I want to start. Just jump back a little bit. When did you first become really interested in Norman Mailer, just on a personal level, before you even wanted to make a film?
Yeah, in the early days of deciding I wanted to become a storyteller, it's sort of a writer slash artist in training. Norman Mailer's work at the time represented artistic courage, unabashed commitment to unpopular ideas, and this sort of worldview that in order to authentically understand the human condition, you need as an artist to be less afraid of the response, of the public's response, of the critic's response, of your friends and family and loved ones' responses. And of course, Mailer takes that to polarizing extremes. But as a person trying to find his voice in the world, it was really inspiring. And my parents, are also artists and creators, and sort of were around in that era that the film is nostalgic for, when it's our great minds that are informing the masses as opposed to celebrities and personalities. And that, to be an agitator, to be a provocateur, to be a contrarian, to invite attack, that was at that time, I think, considered a noble contribution to culture, and that a necessary part of sort of elevating the consciousness of the species. And so, to be able to look back and see the way that town hall debates worked, and the way that idea sparring worked between essayists, and all of that felt like an opportunity to sort of reflect upon how things have changed, and with this film, and to look at sort of some of the ways in which Mailer's own prophecies for the role of ideas, how that would evolve. He very much was correct in saying that books would lose out to a fragmented excess of technology, and long, complex, layered ideas would become shorter and shorter to the point of now being memes. And news anchors' personalities would eclipse the ideas they're talking about, and that we would become less and less interested in, less and less tolerant of ideas that didn't agree with our own. And, in a time sort of dominated by echo chambers and cancel culture and polarization, he would say that we sort of lost our ability to think for ourselves. And so, when I got approached by the family, which was around what would have been Mailer's 100th birthday, so his centennial, they said that. They said, we think he would want to be a scapegoat, a target right now. Like, he fought against those trends with such conviction and imagination for 6 decades. He would want to fight even harder now and put himself out there. And so that invitation from the family, right from the onset, was what interested me. And I was with Stu Schreiberg, who was a producer on the film as well, on that initial call with the kids. And we said our prerequisite to make this movie is that this can't just be a hagiography. We can't sort of just celebrate this intellectual titan's enduring contribution to culture. We have to also acknowledge that he's not a role model, and examine with the same investigative integrity his ego, his mistakes, his sins, the consequences and pain of his actions. And on that call was Danielle, who's one of the 2 daughters who was in the house when Mailer stabbed her mom, and Adele. And so she, of all people, has the right to give permission to show Mailer warts and all. And that's what she did. She said, we would want the stabbing right front and center. We want, if we're going to do a film that celebrates complex, provocative ideas, we need to make a complex, provocative portrait. And so that was the permission from the onset to hand Mailer his just dues. And that was a challenge, right? To try to find a feature-length version of a movie that really is about ideas, and has no hero, because right from the onset, he's an anti-hero. He's not, he's hard to sympathize with. And we wanted to play with that threshold for each viewer. Like, how far are you willing to go, allowing yourself to be pushed and inspired by Mailer before he's gone too far, before it's too much.
So, I mean, what's really interesting is that you do that. Of course, you start the film with the arrest, after the stabbing, so you jump right into that. But you have this really interesting approach, which is to the idea of how to live. That Norman Mailer can be sort of a role model for living courageously and living a fullest life. So I'm wondering how that concept, like how that emerged for you, and I don't know, just your thoughts about like how you made that work. Because I think, like,
Right.
I found the film inspiring from that
Right.
standpoint, and it also
Right.
gives you all the ammunition. If you want to hate Norman Mailer, you can go ahead and do it.
Yeah, that's the challenge is to balance those extremes. And we did a lot of focus grouping in the edit to make sure that both things were persuasive, both sides of the coin there. Yeah, I've never, with this film and with anything I've done in my career, I've never been that interested in comprehensive cradle to grave biopic approaches. And certainly not with a man who was as active as he was for 6 decades. The work alone is enough for multiple series. And then he's got, 9 children and 6 wives and a million different personalities and different accents and different careers. And so, yeah, to try to handle all of that felt very clear from the beginning that we'd be spread too thin and we wouldn't get to deep dive on anything. And so finding a discipline, more singular thematic approach was necessary. And these kind of rules to come alive, that came out of conversations in interviews with people who knew him well, including his children. And it felt like it was consistent that he had been grappling with how far to take his own theories on how to come alive in his own life. So we had an opportunity to use him as a case study in coming alive, and where he might not have gone far enough, and where, my God, he went way too far. So our North Star, I would say, throughout this process was the idea that you don't have to hate Mailer to learn from his mistakes, and you don't have to love him to benefit from his ideas.
Yeah, yeah. You very early on get into his Jewish upbringing, his Jewish background. And, the first sort of maxim you give us is don't be a nice Jewish boy, as a way of living. So I'm just wondering if what your thoughts are about how Norman Mailer's like relationship to being raised Jewish and sort of rebelling against what was expected, like how that helped form him.
Yeah, it was personal for me. I was raised to be a nice Jewish boy, and I think I found a lot of my artistic voice and courage through being rebellious and pushing back as well. Um, you know, the the courage it takes to be unconventional, to be unpopular, to allow people to attack you is deeply inspiring to me personally, and I hope comes through as something that inspires viewers to push themselves out of their comfort zone. That said, for each of us, I think it becomes clear when it's his ego that he's feeding, as opposed to some greater selfless cause to inspire us all to be better. And I cringe. There are moments in the archive where I feel it's so obvious that it's his insecurities he's overcompensating for. And I find that helpful as a mirror to look back at myself and ask, when am I pushing boundaries for personal, selfish, overcompensation and need for validation versus where am I doing it for the greater good?
Well, I guess that leads me to ask about your own. You just had a big success at Sundance with your movie about skywalkers, about a couple that does very dangerous skywalking. And I'd read that you climbed roofs, that
Right.
you also did your own sort of daredevil climbing. So there must be something about you that is attracted to taking like really, serious risks.
Yeah, definitely. Trying on different masks. As it said, but Michael Lennon says in the film, if you leave a mask on long enough, it becomes your face. I don't think I did that. I never left a mask on long enough that it became me, but I certainly dabbled with different identities. I think partly as a way of pushing out of what I felt was the constraints of a privileged upbringing,
Mm,
which I'm incredibly grateful for. But also, I thought, in some of the sort of theories of Mailer's views on the hipster, maybe limited the depth of my experience, my ability to identify with and understand the other. And so to go travel the world and live for many months at a time in poor areas, struggling areas, war-torn areas, climbing roofs, trespassing, breaking the law, trying on being an outlaw or a criminal. All of those things helped shape. Um, I think for me, it helped me on my own terms figure out how far I wanted to push boundaries and who I wanted to be in the world. And I think it then helped me to be able to sympathize with different walks of life as a storyteller. And in many ways, that's what Mailer was doing early on. I mean, he tried being homeless. He was sleeping in subways and um, and then tried to be the bravado 𝙀𝙓𝙋𝙊𝙋𝙀, the non-Jew at war. And so like it's his own version of that trial and error. And I think it's helpful for this career. Yeah.
yeah. So I just, we could talk a lot about the filmmaking, but I just wonder if you could sort of summarize what the challenges were in putting the film together. You have such a wealth of material, original material that you shot with the family, and then such extraordinary interviews, all both archival and new interviews, and then all this archival footage.
Yeah, it was balancing the different narratives that are at play in parallel. On the one hand, you need to have emotional logic to get Mailer from one choice in his life to the next. And at the same time, I thought it was really important that the ideas are at the forefront of this thing. And so you don't want a soup of ideas. You gotta be very selective about the evolution of those ideas. So you have those two narratives, his life, the emotional logic of his life choices, and the natural evolution of his ideas, going at the same time that you have to provide a certain amount of historical context because everything he does is within that framework. So it was balancing those three parallel sets of needs. And Alana Burns, our editor, was really tremendous in challenging me to approach things differently. There's a lot of very creative, abstract approaches to his writing that she was excellent at giving visual language to. So that was a constant tug of war. It's like, how long can we spend in his head and in the abstract idea space versus in the historical context and the reality of who this man is at a time in his life, and then focus grouping that to say, do we lose people by spending too long in one space versus another, or by spending too long with a Mailer that none of us knows how to identify with or sympathize with versus a Mailer who's incredibly inspiring. And so that balancing act took a lot of work. But the most delightful part of the project was just how smart everybody we interviewed
Yeah,
was. I mean, unbelievably profound, insightful interviews everywhere we turned. And
yeah,
so it's just killing babies on the edit room, floor, and just like getting rid of great ideas in order to not have too many. And hopefully stay focused more or less on this one idea of our love-hate relationship with complex ideas.
yeah. So I think for my last question, actually, in thinking about complex ideas, just if you could, I'm sure you thought about this a lot, like what Norman Mailer would think about the environment that we're living in now, where in terms of the exchange of ideas, so many people have fixed ideas, and when you turn on the TV, you're sort of seeking out people who already agree with you. The discourse today is not what it was. So maybe just, I'm just wondering if what he would think if he was alive at 100 years old to see that.
Yeah, again, I think he'd be jumping out of his skin right now. I mean, the idea that people are afraid to express themselves because of potentially losing their platform, that runs contrary to everything he believes. He calls it left totalitarianism,
Yeah.
and he predicted that that would take over, many decades ago. And this is, I think, his worst nightmare as far as censorship and the First Amendment and how it gets handled. I think technology, it was a phobia for him. He felt like it drew us further and further away from the beating pulse of who we are and our ability to find our own version of the world and ourselves. And people's addiction to technology is at a high, like an all-time high that I don't even know that he was able to predict. His fear that we would all become isolated and not interact with each other, not challenge each other. All of these things have really taken hold in our society today, and it felt like that's why it's an opportunity to push these thoughts of his out into the forefront and hopefully create a dialogue.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like I sort of asked to end on a negative note, but I think he
Right.
does give us, but he does give us the inspiration to find a different way and just be, take those risks and be brave and be courageous.
Yeah, very much so. And not to be afraid to lean into parts of your ego and parts of your anger that may fuel you pushing yourself out into the world in a more courageous way. And obviously, where you draw that line before that turns to destruction and violence and
Yeah,
self-harm, that's the challenge. But not to be afraid to push those boundaries, I think would be his message to us all.
right. But ideally without stabbing people.
Exactly. Right.
Well, it's such a great movie on so
Thank
many
you.
levels. So thanks so much, and thanks for talking with us.
Really appreciate it,
Okay,
David. Thank you,
take it
everybody.
easy.